The shovel bit into frozen earth like a tooth-cracking bone. Alara Vance's hand screamed with every push. Raw, blistered, striped with blood where the sheriff's whip had split her knuckles. The townspeople of Bleakwater stood in a ragged semicircle, their breath fogging the autumn air, their eyes flat as river stones. Some held torches, some held rocks, all held silence. "Dig, witch," Sheriff Brody hissed, his shadow stretching long across the grave. "Dig for the child you killed." Alara dug, not because she feared the whip more than the grave, but because she'd stopped fearing anything at all. The hole was shallow, too shallow for a body, too deep for hope. Snowflakes began to fall, sticking to her lashes like tears she wouldn't shed. 3 days earlier, she'd been gathering foxglove by the creek when Brody found her. His breath smelled like whiskey and rot. "A child's dead, Alara, and you were seen near his house." Her herbs had cured that child's fever last week, but Brody didn't want cures. He wanted compliance. When she refused his offer to keep her safe in his bed, he'd slapped her. Hard. The next morning, the child was dead in his crib, lips blue. Brody's men found her shawl near the door. Now, the grave was finished. Brody grabbed her hair, forcing her to her knees at the edge. "Look what you made." He pointed to the headboard he'd carved. "Witch." The crowd murmured, a hungry sound. Alara stared into the hole. It didn't look like death. It looked like silence. Brody drew his pistol. "Any last words?" Alara spat blood into the grave. "Go to hell." He laughed, cocked the hammer. That's when the mountain moved. Silas Thorne wasn't a large man, but he moved like the land itself, quiet, inevitable, and older than sin. He stepped from the tree line, rifle slung low, his face a mask of scar tissue and frost. "That's enough, Brody." The sheriff spun. "Thorne, you got no business here." Silas's voice was gravel under ice. "Neither do you." The standoff lasted seconds, years. Brody's men shifted, eyes darting between Silas's rifle and the sheriff's sweat. Then a rock flew from the crowd. Not at Silas. At Brody. It struck his shoulder, and he roared, firing wild. The bullet tore through pine boughs. Chaos erupted. Silas didn't shoot. He strode forward, grabbed Alara's arm, and hauled her up. She collapsed against him, weightless as ash. He half carried, half dragged her into the woods. Bullets whined past, but the mountain swallowed them. They walked for hours. Alara's bare feet left bloody prints in the snow. Silas never spoke, just walked, his grip steady, his breath a steady cloud in the twilight. When she fell, he picked her up. When she wept, he didn't look. His cabin appeared like a wound in the mountainside, small, smokeless, dark. He kicked the door open, laid her on a cot near a cold hearth, and stoked a fire. It caught slow, then bloomed, filling the room with orange light. Alara curled into a ball, hands tucked under her arms, silent. Silas moved around the cabin, opening a trunk, pulling out bandages, salve, a blanket. He worked on her hands without a word, cleaning the blood, wrapping the wounds. When he was done, he sat across from her, staring into the fire. "Who are you?" she whispered. Her voice was sandpaper. He didn't answer, just pointed to a scar on his forearm, a burn shaped like a cross. Then to the fire, then to her. She understood. He'd been branded too. That night, she dreamed of the grave, of falling into it, of hands grabbing her, pulling her down. She woke screaming, but no sound came out. Silas was there, holding a cup of willow bark tea. He pressed it into her hands. She drank. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow buried her tracks, buried the grave, buried Bleakwater. Inside, Silas added another log to the fire. It never went out, and Alara, for the first time since the digging, slept. The cabin breathed. Not like a living thing, but like something holding its breath. Alara woke to the crackle of fire and the scent of pine sap and old leather. Silas was already awake, sharpening a knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape, 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 the only sound in the room. Her hands throbbed under the bandages, but the pain was distant, muted, like everything else. She didn't speak, hadn't since the grave. Words felt like stones in her throat, too heavy to lift, too sharp to swallow. Silas didn't push. He just slid a bowl of stew across the table, venison and wild onions. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing. The firelight danced on the walls, casting shadows that looked like grasping hands. Brody's men had combed the woods. She'd heard their shouts from the root cellar where Silas hid her, crude jokes about witches, offers of reward for her capture. Silas sat above, rifle across his knees, as still as the mountain. When the men passed, he'd opened the trapdoor and handed her a cup of water. "They'll be back," he'd said. The first words he'd spoken to her since Carrie 5 days earlier. "You're safe here." She nodded, but safety felt like a foreign country. That afternoon, Silas handed her a pair of gloves, too big, patched at the knuckles, and led her outside. The air bit her cheeks, sharp and clean. He showed her how to set rabbit snares, his hands moving with practiced precision. When she fumbled with the wire, he took her hands in his, scarred, calloused, warm, and guided her fingers. His touch wasn't gentle, it was steady, like he was teaching her how to hold something fragile without breaking it. By dusk, they'd caught 3 rabbits. Alara skinned them while Silas built up the fire. Her hands trembled at first, but the knife felt good in her grip, solid, real. When she finished, Silas nodded once, approval without words. That night, the silence in the cabin changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of firelight, of the scent of roasting meat, of the weight of the blanket on her lap. Alara watched Silas clean his rifle, his movements methodical, almost reverent. She wondered who he'd been before the scars, before the fire that never went out. 2 weeks earlier, Deputy Finn had come to the cabin, leaving a sack of supplies on the porch. Flour, salt, a letter. Silas read it, his jaw tightening. "Brody's offering a reward for you," he'd said. Dead or alive? Alara had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, but Silas just tossed the letter into the fire. Let him try. Now, Alara traced the bandages on her hands. The rawness was fading, leaving new skin, pink, tender. She thought of the grave, of the dirt under her nails, of Brody's voice saying, "Dig, witch." She thought of Silas's hands guiding hers, of the fire, of the rabbit snares. Slowly, deliberately, she unwrapped the bandages. Her hands were scarred but whole. She flexed her fingers. No pain, just strength. Silas watched her. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened, like he understood. The next morning, she found him outside, chopping wood. The axe rose and fell, each swing splitting the logs with a clean crack. She picked up a piece of kindling, carried it to the woodpile, and stacked it. Silas paused, watching her. She stacked another piece, then another. Soon they were working side by side, him splitting, her stacking. No words, just the rhythm of axe and wood. The fire in the hearth roared, fed by their labor. That night, Alara spoke, not to Silas, to the fire. "I didn't kill that boy." Her voice was rust, but it was there. Silas didn't look up from whittling a small bird, but he nodded, like he'd known all along. The next day, she went to the gravesite. Silas followed, rifle slung over his shoulder. The snow had melted, revealing the shallow hole. The headboard with "witch" carved into it was still there. Alara stared at it. Then she picked up a rock, and another, and another. Silas watched as she began filling the grave, rock by rock, not with anger, with purpose. When the hole was full, she stood, breathing hard. The headboard lay at her feet. She picked it up, snapped it over her knee, and tossed the pieces into the woods. Silas stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. Not heavy, just there. They walked back to the cabin in silence, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't empty. It was full of fire, of strength, of things unsaid but understood. That night, Alara slept without dreaming of the grave, and Silas, for the first time in years, let the fire die down to embers. The mountain held its breath. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains, burying the world in white. Inside the cabin, Alara bandaged Silas's arm, grazed by a ricocheting bullet 2 days ago when Brody's scouts got too close. The fire crackled, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts. Silas sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the window. "They're coming," he said. Alara didn't ask how he knew. She just finished tying the bandage and picked up the rifle. Her hands no longer trembled. 3 days earlier, Deputy Finn had come again, this time with warning. Brody's rallying men. Says you're a demon witch, Alara. Says Silas is your familiar. He left a map, marked with Brody's route, and a loaded pistol. Silas had studied the map, then burned it. He'll come at dawn, he'd said. Now, dawn bled gray through the snow. Alara stood at the window, watching the tree line. Silas moved silently, barring the door, stacking logs against it. He handed her a knife. She tucked it into her belt. The weight felt right. The first shot shattered the silence. A bullet tore through the window, embedding itself in the wall beside Alara. She didn't flinch. Silas fired back. A cry echoed in the woods. Then silence. Brody's voice cut through the snow. Thorn, send out the witch. This ends now. Alara stepped forward. I'm not a witch. Her voice rang clear, strong. I'm the woman who's going to bury you. Brody laughed. You're already buried, girl. In that grave, you dug. Silas moved beside her, rifle raised. She's not alone. The standoff stretched. Hours, minutes, seconds. Snow piled higher. The fire dwindled. Then Brody made his move. He charged the cabin, 2 men at his side. Alara fired. 1 man fell. Silas fired. The other dropped. Brody stumbled back, clutching his shoulder. Alara stepped onto the porch, rifle trained on Brody. You wanted me in a grave, Brody? Here it is. She gestured to the shallow hole she'd refilled with rocks. Get in. Brody sneered. You think this changes anything? The town still believes you're a witch. Then let them see the truth, Silas said. He tossed a leather satchel at Brody's feet. Stolen town funds, forged evidence, letters to your mistress in Billings. Brody paled. Lies. Deputy Finn stepped from the trees, pistol drawn. No, Sheriff, they're not. He cuffed Brody, who spat curses but didn't resist. Alara watched them drag Brody away. Then she turned to Silas. It's over. He nodded. Not quite. They walked to the gravesite together. Alara knelt, placing wildflowers on the rocks. Silas laid a hand on her shoulder. You buried it, he said. Now, let something grow. That night, they sat by the fire, not speaking. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of peace, of strength, of things unsaid but understood. Spring came late to the mountains, but it came stubborn. The snow retreated in muddy patches, revealing green shoots that clawed their way toward the sun. Alara stood at the edge of the grave, no longer a hole, but a mound of earth she'd shaped into a garden. Her hands, scarred but strong, pressed seeds into the soil. Chamomile, lavender, yarrow, plants that healed, plants that remembered. Silas watched from the cabin porch, the rifle gone, replaced by a whittling knife. He shaped a small bird, oak, smooth, its wings outstretched. The fire in the hearth had burned low for the first time in years. Embers glowed like fading memories. 2 months earlier, Brody's trial had been swift. Deputy Finn testified, presenting the satchel of evidence Silas had uncovered. The town of Bleakwater had watched in silence as Brody was dragged away in chains. Some whispered apologies, others looked away. Alara had stood tall, her hands clasped in front of her, the scars on her knuckles white against her skin. When it was over, she'd walked back to the mountain without a word. Now she straightened, wiping dirt from her palms. Silas joined her, placing the wooden bird at the garden's edge. For the child, he said. His voice was gravel, but softer now. Alara nodded. And for the others. The garden grew. Alara tended it daily, pruning, watering, whispering to the plants. Silas built a fence around it, cedar posts and rough-hewn rails. They worked in silence, but the silence was different now. It wasn't empty, it was full, of shared purpose, of unspoken understanding. One afternoon, Old Man Haskins arrived, leading a mule loaded with books. Bleakwater's got a schoolhouse now, he said, his voice like dry leaves. Teachers asking for help. He gestured to Alara. Said you might know letters. Alara hesitated. The schoolhouse. In Bleakwater. Where they'd called her witch. Where they'd made her dig her own grave. Silas placed a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to go. She looked at the garden. At the lavender blooming purple. At the yarrow standing tall. I do. The next morning, she walked down the mountain. Silas followed, rifle slung over his shoulder. Not for protection, but for company. The town watched as they passed. Some stared. Some nodded. None spoke. The schoolhouse was a small cabin with a crooked chimney. Children sat on rough benches, their eyes wide as Alara entered. The teacher, a young woman with kind eyes, smiled. We've been waiting. Alara taught them to read. Not from primers, from the land, from the garden. She showed them how to identify plants by their leaves, how to read the sky for storms, how to listen to the mountain silence. The children leaned in, their faces bright with curiosity. One day, a little girl with braids asked, "Why do you have scars?" Alara held up her hands. "These are from digging a grave." She paused. "But I planted a garden instead." The girl nodded. "Can I help?" That evening, Alara returned to the cabin to find Silas tending the fire, but this time he let it die. The embers faded to ash. "It's time," he said. She understood. The fire had been his penance, his way of keeping the past alive. Now, he was letting it go. Spring deepened. The garden flourished. Children from Bleakwater visited, bringing seeds, stories, laughter. Alara taught them to read the land. Silas taught them to carve. The mountain, once a place of isolation, became a place of gathering. One evening, as the sun set, Alara stood at the edge of the garden. Silas joined her, handing her the wooden bird. She placed it among the lavender. "It's beautiful," she said. He nodded. "Like the garden." They stood in silence, watching the light fade. The scars on their hands glowed faintly in the dusk, not as reminders of pain, but as proof of survival. The mountain whispered around them, not with wind or storms, but with peace. And in the quiet, Alara finally heard it, the sound of her own voice, strong, clear, free.